Welcome to Betrayal Files, where office dramas are.
The hum of fluorescent lights filled the office, a steady drone that had long ago faded into the background of Meline Pierce's workdays. She had spent 12 years under that buzz, 12 years of late nights, flawless reports, and quietly fixing other people's mistakes before they reached the executive floor. Yet that Monday morning, something felt different. The Stratocell building, usually alive with chatter and the clatter of keyboards, was hushed. Too hushed. The conversations that did happen were clipped, furtive, co-workers leaning in close, voices lowered as though the walls themselves had grown ears. Meline caught the look in their eyes as she walked past. Pity. Avoidance. And fear. She sat at her desk, staring at the string of calendar invites that had appeared overnight. Leadership strategy session. Confidential. Mandatory attendance. The titles were vague, but the implication was not. Stratocell had been bleeding talent for months, its stock slipping in quiet increments no one wanted to admit were connected. Rumors of restructuring swirled like storm clouds. Now the storm had arrived. Meline tried to focus on her work, her fingers gliding over the keyboard, but her eyes kept drifting to the glass conference room across the hall. Inside, the executives gathered in knots, their suits a uniform wall of gray and navy. They didn't notice her. Or worse, they did, and quickly looked away. At noon, Martin appeared. He was her direct supervisor, a man who once praised her as the operational backbone of the company. But today, his smile was strained, his tie askew as if he'd been tugging at it all morning. "Meline, can I see you in my office?" His voice was careful. Too careful. Her stomach tightened. She followed him down the hall, past desks that suddenly seemed more like witness stands. In Martin's office, the blinds were drawn. The air smelled faintly of stale coffee. He gestured for her to sit but didn't take his own chair. Instead, he stood behind his desk, fingers drumming against the polished wood. "There's no easy way to say this," he began, avoiding her eyes. "The leadership team has made some difficult decisions regarding restructuring. Effective immediately, your role has been eliminated." The word struck like a hammer. For a moment, all Meline heard was the blood rushing in her ears. She blinked, trying to make sense of the syllables, as though they had been spoken in a foreign tongue. "Eliminated," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "After 12 years. Martin swallowed hard. "I fought for you, I really did. But it was above me. They said your position," he faltered, finally meeting her gaze. The guilt in his eyes was real, but it was useless. "I'm sorry, Meline." She sat frozen, the fluorescent hum suddenly deafening. Images tumbled through her mind, the endless nights spent perfecting acquisition models, the weekends sacrificed, the birthday parties missed. 12 years distilled into 2 words, position eliminated. "You'll receive severance," Martin added quickly, as though a financial bandage could mend the wound. "And HR will walk you through everything." Meline almost laughed. Severance. HR, words so hollow they echoed in her chest like mockery. She stood, her hands trembling only slightly. "Thank you, Martin," she said, though the words tasted like ash. Out in the hallway, she moved like a ghost. Desks blurred past. Colleagues avoided her eyes, burying themselves in screens, pretending they hadn't just witnessed an execution. The company that once felt like her second home had become a courtroom, and the verdict had been delivered, guilty of being expendable. By the time she reached the elevator, her shock had hardened into something else, something darker. Not rage, not yet, but the seed of it. A gnawing certainty that this was not just about restructuring. Stratocell had made her disappear with a flick of a pen, and they expected her to slink away quietly. She stepped into the elevator, the mirrored walls reflecting a woman she barely recognized. Her blouse was crisp, her hair pulled into its usual knot, but her eyes were different. They burned with the sharp, fragile clarity of someone who has just seen the machinery of power grind her down, and refuses to forget the sound. As the doors slid shut, she whispered to herself, almost without realizing, this isn't the end. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the humiliation and grief, a quiet thought took root. If Stratocell believed she would vanish without a fight, they had gravely underestimated her. The HR office was on the 12th floor, sterile and quiet, as though silence itself was part of the decor. Meline had walked these halls many times over the years to welcome new hires, to finalize promotion paperwork, to shepherd through the messy logistics of other people's careers. Now, she was the one being processed. Patricia, the head of human resources, greeted her with the polished smile of someone who had rehearsed sympathy in the mirror. She gestured toward a chair across a desk already stacked with folders. Meline, I know this must be difficult, but let's get you squared away. Squared away. As if 12 years of dedication could be folded neatly into a manila envelope. Patricia slid a packet across the desk. This is your severance package. It includes 12 weeks' pay, continuation of health benefits through the end of the quarter, and a non-disclosure agreement to protect company interests. Sign here, and we'll process the wire transfer today. Meline picked up the packet, her eyes scanning the dense text. Words leapt out, non-disparagement, no further claims, confidentiality. It was a muzzle disguised as generosity. And beneath it, she sensed something missing. Something important. She flipped through the pages again, her pulse quickening. Where is it? For years, she had been part of conversations around compensation, equity, stock options. Stratocell's promise had always been clear: stay loyal, and equity vests. It was the company's way of keeping its best people chained to the wheel. But in this packet, there was no mention of equity. None. It was as though her 12 years of stock grants had never existed. Meline looked up slowly. Patricia, there's nothing here about my equity compensation. Patricia blinked, then smoothed her blouse with deliberate calm. Equity is complicated in cases of termination. Your role was eliminated, so those shares don't vest. That's not what my contract says. The words left Meline's lips before she had time to soften them. Patricia's smile thinned. Meline, I understand this is emotional, but these agreements are standard. Everyone signs them. Everyone. That word echoed. How many others had been quietly stripped of what was theirs, walking away with a fraction of their worth? Meline placed the pen down firmly on the desk. I need time to review this. Patricia's eyes hardened. The performance of kindness slipped. If you delay, the offer could be rescinded. This is generous, Meline. I'd advise you to take it. There it was, the blade in the back, cloaked in velvet. The company wasn't just discarding her, it was erasing her, ensuring her years of equity vanished without a trace. She stood, clutching the packet, her knuckles white. I'll get back to you. The walk out of the HR office felt like trudging through molasses. Every instinct screamed at her to sign, to grab what she could and run. But beneath the panic, a sharper voice whispered, they are stealing from you. And if they've done it to you, they've done it to others. Back at her apartment, Meline spread the documents across her kitchen table, the surface buried under legalese. She dug into her old files, pulling out contracts, offer letters, benefit summaries she'd long ago filed away. And there it was, in black and white. In the event of termination without cause, all vested equity shall be paid out in full at the current fair market value. Her breath caught. Termination without cause. That was exactly what had happened. They hadn't fired her for misconduct. They hadn't accused her of poor performance. They had simply eliminated her role. Which meant every share was hers. By her math, the total value was staggering, millions. Her hands trembled, but not from fear this time. From clarity. From the realization that Straticel had tried to cut her loose quietly, hoping she wouldn't notice the fortune they owed her. For the first time since Martin's words, "Your role has been eliminated," she felt something other than grief. She felt resolve. She whispered it aloud, as though testing the weight of the vow. "They think I'm gone. But I'm not. Not yet." Outside her window, the city glowed against the night, each light a reminder of the lives still turning, the deals still made. Somewhere in those towers, executives toasted their cleverness, certain they had rid themselves of a loyal employee without consequence. Meline Pierce smiled faintly, her reflection in the glass sharper than she remembered. If they thought she would disappear quietly, they had underestimated her. This wasn't the end. This was the beginning. The documents lay scattered across her kitchen table like the wreckage of a storm. Severance papers, old contracts, stock grant notices, each page a reminder of the life Straticel wanted her to forget. Meline had been sifting through them for hours, her hair pulled loose from its knot, her coffee gone cold. She nearly missed it. A thin folder wedged in the back of a drawer, edges yellowed with time. She pulled it free and opened it, her pulse quickening as she read the title line, "Employment Agreement, Meline Pierce, Senior Operations Manager. 12 years old. Signed in ink. Witnessed by a former HR director who'd since retired." She traced her finger down the dense paragraphs, remembering the day she'd signed it. Back then, the equity clause had seemed almost abstract, a distant promise, a golden carrot always out of reach. But now, under the harsh kitchen light, those lines burned with new power. In the event of termination without cause, all vested equity shall be paid out in full, valued at the current fair market price as of the termination date. There it was. Simple. Unambiguous. A line the lawyers at Straticel had either overlooked or deliberately chosen to ignore. Meline sat back in her chair, her chest rising and falling. The math was dizzying. Her equity had been accumulating for over a decade, layered with performance-based grants, annual refreshers, and retention bonuses. She had helped design some of those very programs, encouraging younger employees to think long-term. Now, the long-term had arrived. By her rough calculation, Straticel owed her at least $2.2 million. The realization was electric. For the first time since walking out of Martin's office, she didn't feel powerless. She felt dangerous. But danger came with risk. She knew what Straticel expected, that she would sign the NDA, take her severance, and vanish. Challenging them meant open war. They had money, lawyers, an entire machine designed to grind down anyone foolish enough to stand in their way. Her phone buzzed on the table, a text from an old colleague, "Sorry about what happened. Heard whispers you got hit in the restructuring. You didn't deserve that." She stared at the screen, anger rising like a tide. No, she didn't deserve it. And how many others had been hit, silenced by the same NDA, stripped of equity they had earned? How many had walked away believing they had no choice? She looked back at the contract. This wasn't just paperwork. It was a weapon. The decision crystallized in her mind. She needed help, someone who could sharpen this weapon into a blade capable of cutting through Straticel's defenses. A lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but one unafraid of corporate giants. Her laptop glowed as she searched late into the night: corporate employment disputes, equity compensation lawsuits, whistleblower protections. Article after article painted the same picture: companies betting on silence, employees too afraid or too tired to fight back. But every so often, a case surfaced where the individual won, where persistence and precision shattered the corporation's armor. One name kept appearing in those stories: Nora Alden. An employment attorney known in whispered circles as the Scalpel. Cold, ruthless, brilliant. She had dismantled Fortune 500 firms with surgical precision, leaving their boardrooms shaken and their NDAs in tatters. Meline copied the number. Her hand trembled slightly as she pressed call. The line rang once, twice. Then a voice answered, clipped and cool. "This is Alden." For a moment, Meline almost lost her courage. Then she glanced at the contract spread across her table, the words "full vested equity" staring back at her. She steadied her voice. "My name is Meline Pierce. I believe my former employer owes me over $2 million. And they're pretending they don't." There was silence on the other end. Then, a soft, deliberate laugh. "Tell me everything," Nora said. And just like that, the tide began to turn. That night, as the city outside pulsed with neon and headlights, Meline felt the shift inside herself. She was no longer the discarded employee skulking away in shame. She was a challenger preparing for battle. Stratocell had underestimated her. They had treated her like an expendable line item. But they were about to learn a truth they had forgotten. Even the smallest stone can bring down a giant. The cafe was nearly empty, the kind of discreet place where deals were whispered and secrets exchanged. Rain slicked the sidewalks outside, blurring the neon signs into streaks of red and blue. Meline sat in a corner booth, hands curled around a cup of untouched tea. Every few seconds, she checked the door, half expecting that Nora Alden might not come at all. Then the door swung open, and she did. Nora was nothing like Meline expected. No expensive suit, no soft approach. She wore a dark blazer over a black turtleneck, her silver hair cut in a sharp bob that framed her angular face. A leather briefcase dangled casually from one hand. She scanned the cafe once, eyes like a hawk's, then crossed the room with measured steps. "Meline Pierce." "Yes," Meline said, rising halfway. Nora sat without ceremony, placing her briefcase on the table. "Show me the contract." It was not a greeting, but it was efficient. Meline slid the folder across. Nora flipped it open, her eyes skimming the text with rapid precision. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the hiss of the espresso machine. Meline's pulse thundered in her ears. Finally, Nora looked up. "You're right. They owe you $2.2 million, by my estimate." The words landed like a gavel. Meline exhaled, a sound half relief, half disbelief. "So I'm not crazy." "Not at all." Nora leaned back, steepling her fingers. "You're just dangerous. And that's why they're trying to erase you." Meline swallowed. "What do I do?" Nora's smile was thin, almost predatory. "First, you don't sign their NDA. That's the muzzle they use to keep people quiet. Second, you let me take this to them directly. I won't go through HR. I'll go straight to the board." Straight to the board. The idea seemed impossible. "That's where it hurts," Nora said simply. "Executives don't care about fairness. They care about exposure. If word gets out they've been stripping employees of vested equity, you won't be the only one demanding payment. They'd rather bleed once than risk an audit that could cost them 10 times as much." Meline's hands tightened around her cup. "They'll fight back. Of course they will. They'll bluff, threaten, stall. They'll try to scare you into silence. But remember this," Nora tapped the contract with one perfectly manicured nail. "You have the truth. And the truth, leveraged correctly, is lethal." Meline studied the woman across from her. Nora radiated a cold confidence, the kind that came from years of staring down boardrooms and never blinking first. She was ruthless, but not reckless. And for the first time, Meline felt she wasn't facing Stratocell alone. "Why help me?" she asked quietly. Nora arched a brow. Because cases like yours remind these companies they're not gods. And frankly, I enjoy watching giants fall. A laugh escaped Meline, small, but real. It felt strange after days of silence and rage, but it lightened something inside her. Then let's make them fall. Nora's eyes gleamed. Good. Here's how it works. I'll request a meeting with David Kessler, the CEO, and Patricia from HR. They'll expect you to come crawling. Instead, you'll sit across the table, calm and steady, while I lay out exactly what they owe you, and what will happen if they refuse. You won't have to raise your voice. Fear does the talking for us. Meline nodded slowly, the plan settling into her bones. She could almost see it, the glass-walled boardroom, the executives shifting in their seats, the quiet panic behind their practiced smiles. For years, she had been the invisible hand keeping the machine running. Now, she would be the stone in its gears. Nora closed the folder with a snap. One more thing. This isn't just about money. It's about dignity. They wanted to erase you. We're going to make sure they can't. The word struck deep, resonating with something Meline hadn't even admitted to herself. Yes, the money mattered, it could change her life, but what she wanted more was recognition. Proof that she had been more than a disposable cog. Proof that her years had weight. Outside, the rain eased into a steady drizzle. Nora gathered her briefcase, standing to leave. I'll be in touch with the meeting details. Be ready. Meline watched her go, a storm of nerves and determination swirling inside. She had come into the cafe alone, a discarded employee clutching old paperwork. She left with an ally, a scalpel aimed at the heart of Stratocell. As she stepped out into the wet night, the city lights reflected on the pavement, fractured and sharp. For the first time since her termination, Meline didn't feel like she was drowning. She felt like she was sharpening a blade. And soon, she would use it. The nights grew longer after her meeting with Nora. By day, the city surged ahead with its relentless rhythm, horns blaring, elevators rushing, inboxes filling, but by night, silence swallowed Meline whole. The apartment felt cavernous, every creak of the floorboards reminding her how alone she was in this fight. She would sit at her kitchen table, the same table where she had discovered her old contract, and replay the cafe conversation in her head. Nora's voice was sharp and steady, they owe you. Fear does most of the work for us. The words had felt like armor at the time. But in the quiet hours after midnight, doubt crept through the cracks. What if she lost? The thought slithered into her mind like smoke. Stratocell had entire legal teams at their disposal, lawyers who billed more in an hour than she had once made in a week. They could bury her in paperwork, drag the fight through years of litigation, drain her savings until there was nothing left. Some nights she stared at the ceiling, her chest tight with panic. Would it be safer to sign the NDA, take the severance, and disappear like the others? To accept that she had been expendable, just another casualty of restructuring. But then the anger returned, hot and insistent. She remembered the cold dismissal in Patricia's office, the hollow sympathy of Martin's eyes. She remembered the missing clause in the severance packet, a deliberate omission of $2.2 million. They had gambled on her silence. They had underestimated her. And beneath the fear, that thought was intoxicating. One evening, unable to sleep, she spread the papers across her living room floor. Her original employment contract lay side by side with the severance agreement. She traced the language with her finger, line by line, comparing, circling, underlining. Each word was a battleground. Termination without cause. Vested equity. Full payout at market value. The phrases repeated like a mantra. "This is mine," she whispered into the empty room. Her own voice startled her, low and fierce. Still, the weight of uncertainty pressed heavy. She thought of her mortgage, of retirement savings, of the life she had meticulously built around the stability Straticel once promised. Everything now hung in the balance of a gamble against a giant. She closed her eyes and pictured the boardroom she knew so well: glass walls, gleaming table, the hum of nervous energy before big decisions. She imagined herself sitting across from David Kessler, the CEO, with Nora at her side. Could she keep her composure when they tried to intimidate her? Could she sit still as they minimized her worth, as they painted her as naive, mistaken, desperate? The doubt twisted deeper. She wasn't a fighter. She had never raised her voice in a meeting, never demanded the spotlight. She had built her career on competence and quiet reliability. What if she wasn't built for war? And yet, perhaps that was her advantage. Straticel saw her as invisible, ordinary, safe to discard. That was the very reason they hadn't bothered to cover their tracks. They didn't believe she would fight. They didn't believe she could. That realization steadied her. Over the next week, she developed small rituals to calm herself. In the mornings, she jogged along the river, letting the cold air clear her head. At night, she lit a single candle on her desk and read through her notes, the flickering flame a reminder that light could survive even in darkness. Friends reached out with cautious sympathy, colleagues who whispered their condolences but never asked for details, afraid of what might happen if they aligned with her. Meline didn't blame them. She understood the fear. But she also recognized how deep the company's shadow stretched, silencing even those who had already escaped its grasp. Every text, every hushed call reinforced the same truth: Straticel's culture wasn't built on loyalty. It was built on fear. And fear, she realized, was brittle. By the end of the second week, Meline had stopped wavering. The nights were still heavy, the doubt still whispered, but the decision was set in stone. She would not sign their NDA. She would not take their hush money. She stood before her bathroom mirror one evening, studying her reflection. Her hair was loose, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion, but there was something else too, a steadiness, a glint of steel she had never seen before. "This is not just about me," she said aloud. "This is about every person they erased. And they're going to remember my name." The apartment was silent in response, but the words lingered, filling the space with something solid. For the first time since her termination, Meline felt not just like a victim, not just like a fighter, but like a force. The fear was still there, yes, but it no longer held the steering wheel. Straticel thought she would vanish quietly. Instead, she was preparing to walk straight into their glass-walled fortress and make them see her. The boardroom was exactly as Meline remembered: gleaming walnut table, floor-to-ceiling windows casting the city in miniature, glass walls that made every whisper feel exposed. She had spent years in this very room, arranging reports, smoothing out last-minute crises so the executives could present their perfect narratives. Today, for the first time, she wasn't here to serve. She was here to confront. David Kessler, Straticel's CEO, sat at the head of the table, his tailored suit immaculate, his expression carved from stone. Patricia from HR occupied his right, her smile taut as stretched wire. Two other directors flanked them, whispering to one another before going quiet the moment Meline entered. Nora Alden strode in first, heels clicking against the polished floor. She didn't so much as glance at the skyline view or the muted art on the walls. Her presence filled the space with a cold authority, the kind that demanded attention without raising its voice. Meline followed, her pulse hammering in her ears, clutching the folder that held her contract like a shield. David leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "Miss Pierce," he said, his tone detached, as though her 12 years of service had been reduced to a footnote. "I understand you have concerns about your termination package." Before Meline could speak, Nora placed the contract on the table with a deliberate thud. "Concerns? No. My client has facts. Facts your severance agreement conveniently ignored." Patricia's smile didn't falter, but her eyes narrowed. Equity is contingent on continued employment. That's standard. Ms. Pierce's role was eliminated. The equity doesn't vest. Nora's laugh was soft, surgical. I've read the contract. Termination without cause triggers immediate payout of all vested equity at market value. You eliminated her role without cause, did you not? David's jaw tightened. We acted in the best interests of the company. That wasn't my question. Nora's voice sliced through the room. Was Ms. Pierce terminated for cause, misconduct, violation of policy, malfeasance, or was her role simply eliminated? A silence settled, heavy and suffocating. Finally, Patricia spoke, each word weighed down with reluctance. Her role was eliminated. Excellent, Nora said smoothly. She tapped the contract. Then you owe her $2.2 million. Wire transfer, full amount, within 5 business days. No NDA. No conditions. One of the directors, a man with thinning hair and restless hands, leaned forward. That's absurd. Do you know how many former employees would come crawling out of the woodwork if we gave in to this demand? Nora turned her gaze on him, calm and merciless. That's exactly what should concern you. If you refuse, we proceed with discovery. We subpoena separation agreements from the past 5 years. We examine every termination. I imagine Ms. Pierce won't be the only one you've shortchanged. Shall we tally the damages together? Or would you prefer to settle quietly today? The color drained from the director's face. He sat back, muttering under his breath. David shifted in his chair, the mask of composure cracking just slightly. He glanced at Patricia, whose smile had vanished entirely. We need time to review. You have 15 minutes, Nora replied. She rose, gathering her papers. We'll step outside. When we return, I expect a decision. She gestured to Meline, who followed her out into the hallway. The door closed behind them, and the muffled chaos began almost instantly. Raised voices, hurried phone calls, the frantic gesturing of men who were used to controlling every outcome and suddenly found themselves cornered. Meline leaned against the wall, her knees threatening to give way. How do you think it's going? She whispered. Nora's expression didn't change, but there was satisfaction in her tone. They're terrified. The question is whether they're more afraid of paying you or of the audit revealing how many others they've stolen from. Either way, fear makes people practical. They'll pay. Meline closed her eyes, letting the words sink in. For days, she had been drowning in doubt, replaying every worst-case scenario. But now, standing in the corridor with Nora's calm certainty beside her and panic erupting on the other side of the glass wall, she felt something shift. For the first time, she realized she wasn't the one on trial. They were. When the door finally opened again, David looked older, the weight of 15 frantic minutes etched into his face. Patricia's posture was rigid, her jaw tight. David cleared his throat. We're prepared to offer immediate payment of the full equity value. Wire transfer by close of business today. Meline's heart lurched. For a moment, the room blurred, the word surreal. 2.2 million. Her freedom. Her vindication. No NDA, Nora said. David hesitated, then nodded. No NDA. Patricia's voice was tight, each word dragged out like a concession extracted under duress. Ms. Pierce retains the right to discuss her termination freely. Nora looked at Meline. Meline met her gaze and nodded. Then we have an agreement, Nora said. The rest of the meeting was a blur of signatures, forms, and stiff handshakes. But beneath it all, Meline felt something deeper, the tectonic shift of power, the reversal of a narrative they had tried to script without her. She walked out of Stratacel's glass tower into the fading afternoon light, her reflection in the windows no longer that of an invisible employee. For 12 years, she had kept the machine running quietly in the background. Today, she had forced the machine to stop and pay attention. The giant had flinched. And she had made it happen. The wire transfer was set in motion before the ink on the papers had dried, but the true storm was only beginning. Inside Stratacel's headquarters, the boardroom doors had barely shut behind Meline and Nora when the dam of executive composure broke. David Kessler dropped into his chair, tugging at his tie as if it were strangling him. Patricia slammed the folder shut with more force than necessary, her polished smile long gone. The two directors exchanged panicked looks, one already pulling out his phone, whispering into it with the urgency of a man reporting a fire. "This is a disaster," Patricia hissed. $2.2 million for one person. Do you realize what happens if word spreads? It already will, the restless director snapped, running a hand through his thinning hair. She didn't sign an NDA. She can say whatever she wants. Every former employee who left in the last 5 years will smell blood. David's voice was low, measured, but beneath the calm was a quiver of rage. You think I don't know that? I warned against overusing these terminations. But the board wanted cost savings. Quick exits. Clean numbers. Clean numbers. Patricia shot back. We've been cooking the books on equity. If an auditor looks too closely. The room fell silent, the word auditor hanging heavy in the air. Everyone knew what that meant. Regulators. Lawsuits. Headlines. The second director finally spoke, his voice trembling despite his effort to steady it. We need containment. Reach out to recent terminations. Offer settlements before they start asking questions. And what if they already are? Patricia's voice dripped with venom. What if Meline Pierce is on the phone to them right now? She was well liked. Respected. If she tells them what she uncovered. Then we're finished, the restless director muttered. David slammed his palm against the table, startling everyone. No. We are not finished. We adapt. We survive. We always do. But even as he spoke, his eyes betrayed him. He had seen giants fall before. Competitors once untouchable had been dismantled by a single lawsuit, a single whistleblower. Stratacel was not invincible. And deep down, he knew it. Meanwhile, in a quiet corner of the city, Meline sat in her kitchen, staring at the bank notification on her phone. The numbers seemed unreal, a fortune condensed into a string of digits. 2.2 million. Enough to pay off her mortgage, secure her future, buy her time to decide what came next. But the money, staggering as it was, wasn't what made her hands tremble. It was the knowledge of what had just happened behind those glass walls, the board of directors scrambling, panicking, turning on each other like rats in a flooding ship. For 12 years, she had walked past those rooms invisible, her work unacknowledged, her presence taken for granted. Today, she had brought them to their knees. Her phone buzzed. A text from an old colleague, something's happening. HR's reaching out to people who were let go last year. Asking them to review their agreements. Did you start this? Meline smiled faintly, a mixture of pride and vindication. She didn't reply, but she didn't need to. The dominoes had begun to fall. Back at Stratacel, the panic spread like wildfire. Patricia convened an emergency meeting with HR managers, barking orders to review every file from the last 3 years. The team worked late into the night, fluorescent lights glaring as they pored over termination packets, comparing them against contracts. For every discrepancy they found, the knot in Patricia's stomach tightened. The directors demanded updates every hour, voices sharp with desperation. How many cases could expose us? How much liability are we talking about? No one had an answer. The numbers shifted with every discovery, climbing higher, then higher still. By midnight, David sat alone in his office, the skyline glittering beyond the glass. His reflection stared back at him, weary and drawn. He thought of Meline, the quiet woman who had once sat in the back of strategy sessions, invisible and reliable. He had barely noticed her presence when she was employed, but now she was everywhere, her name whispered in panic down every hallway, her contract a ticking time bomb beneath every ledger. It struck him with cruel irony. They had tried to erase her. Instead, she had become the shadow looming over everything they did. For Meline, the silence of her apartment was no longer suffocating. It was powerful. She imagined the chaos she had left behind, the frantic phone calls, the desperate attempts to put out fires. The giant was stumbling, and all it had taken was one stone thrown with precision. She leaned back in her chair, Finn the cat curled in her lap, and allowed herself a rare smile. They thought they had eliminated her. But now, she was the reason they couldn't sleep at night. And the best part? This was only the beginning. The email arrived at 4:37 p.m. on a gray Thursday. Subject line, wire transfer confirmation. Meline stared at it for a full minute before clicking. The numbers glowed against the screen, impossible, surreal. $2,273,000. Her account balance had more than doubled in the blink of an eye. She set the phone down on the counter, then picked it back up, checking again, afraid the numbers might dissolve if she looked away. But they stayed. Real. Permanent. The transfer had gone through. Her knees felt weak. She slid into a chair at the kitchen table, the late afternoon light spilling across the wood. Finn, her cat, leapt into her lap, purring, grounding her in the present. She stroked his fur absent-mindedly, her mind racing through 12 years of sacrifice, dismissal, humiliation, and now, this. Not a gift. Not a windfall. Justice. The irony struck her. Stratasol had spent months, maybe years, shaving off millions by stripping employees of their rightful equity. And yet here she was, a single woman who had forced them to pay, not only what they owed but also the price of exposure. They hadn't settled because they wanted to. They had settled because they were afraid. Her phone buzzed with another message. This one from Nora, funds confirmed. No NDA. They caved. You won, Meline. Rest tonight, you've earned it. Rest. The word felt foreign. For weeks she had lived in adrenaline, dread, and midnight pacing. Now, for the first time, she could exhale. She stood, moving to the window. The city stretched out before her, lights blinking on as dusk settled. For years, she had watched this view while hunched over spreadsheets, wondering if her efforts made any difference. Tonight, the skyline looked different. Brighter. Not because the city had changed, but because she had. At Stratasol, the atmosphere was anything but restful. The executives convened in emergency sessions, whispering in guarded tones. Though the wire transfer was complete, the damage was far from contained. Meline's victory had cracked something in the foundation: confidence, secrecy, control. David Kessler rubbed his temples as Patricia listed the growing concerns. 3 former employees have already contacted us after hearing rumors, she said grimly. 2 demanded reviews of their equity packages. 1 has retained counsel. David's fist clenched around his pen. Pierce has turned us into prey. But Patricia didn't respond. She didn't need to. The truth was etched across every face in the room. Stratasol's carefully constructed fortress was vulnerable, and a woman they had dismissed as expendable had been the one to prove it. For Meline, the victory was both quiet and seismic. There were no champagne toasts, no confetti, no triumphant announcement. She hadn't told her sister, hadn't posted on LinkedIn, hadn't breathed a word to the friends who had tiptoed around her since her termination. Instead, she let the silence wrap around her like a blanket. She ordered takeout, sat at the table with Finn curled beside her, and ate slowly while watching the sun dip behind the horizon. Each bite tasted richer, not because of the food but because of the freedom it represented. 2.2 million meant she could pay off her mortgage tomorrow if she chose. She could fund her retirement accounts, take a year off, travel, start over. But the real currency wasn't money, it was dignity. For weeks, she had been haunted by the way Patricia's voice had dripped with condescension, the way Martin had avoided her eyes. They had treated her like nothing. And now, they had paid her more than she had ever dared imagine. Not to silence her. Not to erase her. But because she had forced them to. She thought back to Nora's words in the cafe, "This isn't just about money. It's about dignity." She finally understood. Later that evening, she opened the drawer where her employment contract still rested. She placed it carefully in a frame and leaned it against the wall of her home office. It wasn't a trophy. It was a reminder. A reminder that sometimes power doesn't come from shouting the loudest but from reading the fine print, from refusing to be erased. Her phone buzzed once more. Another text from a colleague, "HR just called me. They want to review my separation paperwork. Did you have anything to do with this?" Meline smiled to herself. She typed back, "Maybe. Don't let them push you around." She set the phone aside and leaned back in her chair, the city lights twinkling through the window. For the first time since everything began, she felt steady, whole. The giant had tried to crush her, to erase her existence with a line item and a bland smile. But she had survived, fought back, and forced it to bend. This was the moment the tide had turned. The moment the underdog stood tall. The moment David met Goliath, and Goliath blinked. The sky was painted in shades of copper and rose as the sun slipped toward the horizon. Meline sat at her kitchen table, the same place where weeks earlier she had pored over severance documents with trembling hands. Now the papers were gone, replaced by a simple dinner plate and a glass of wine she had finally allowed herself to pour. Her phone still glowed with the bank notification. She had checked it half a dozen times, just to be sure the numbers hadn't changed. $2,273,000. Every glance brought a flicker of disbelief, followed by a slow, settling calm. It wasn't the money alone, it was what it symbolized. The boardroom had tried to erase her, to turn her 12 years into silence and ash. Instead, she had walked out with her dignity intact and the company's fear etched into every check they would write from now on. Finn leapt into her lap, curling into a warm ball of fur. She stroked him absently, her gaze drifting to the fading light outside. For years, she had measured sunsets by how much work she still had left to do, another email to send, another spreadsheet to revise before tomorrow's meeting. Now, the sunset simply was. No deadline. No frantic typing. No guilt. Her thoughts wandered back through the weeks. The shock of Martin's words, "Your role has been eliminated." The coldness in Patricia's office. The sleepless nights when panic gnawed at her chest. The moment she found her contract, her lifeline. And Nora, sharp as a scalpel, cutting through corporate lies with precision. Each memory was a step on a jagged path that had led her here, to this quiet kitchen bathed in golden light. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to feel the weight of it, not just the fear and the fight, but the resilience that had carried her. She lifted the glass of wine, holding it to the light. "To surviving," she murmured. The toast wasn't grand or loud, but it was honest. Across the city, Stratocell was far from quiet. Reports piled up, phones rang late into the evening, and executives shuffled nervously through hastily scheduled meetings. Meline's name was spoken in hushed tones, her victory rippling outward like a stone thrown into still water. But Meline didn't see any of that. She didn't need to. She knew. She could feel the tremors and the messages trickling into her inbox, colleagues reaching out cautiously, some thanking her, others simply asking, "Is it true?" She didn't answer right away. Tonight wasn't about them. Tonight was hers. She carried her wine to the window, leaning against the cool glass. The city stretched out before her, towers glinting in the fading sun. Somewhere in those offices, decisions were being made that would reshape lives, as hers had been reshaped. But for once, she wasn't at their mercy. She was free. It struck her then how strange victory could feel. She had imagined it would be triumphant, blazing with satisfaction. Instead, it was quiet. A deep, bone-deep stillness, as though the universe had finally exhaled with her. She thought of David Kessler's face, drawn tight with defeat. Patricia's brittle voice when she admitted the truth. The restless director muttering about others coming forward. They had looked at her like a problem to erase. And now, she was a scar they would carry forever. Her lips curved into a faint smile. The best revenge wasn't rage, nor spectacle. It was this, the peace of knowing she had been right, the certainty that they would never forget her name. As night fell, she returned to her office, the framed contract propped against the wall. She studied it under the lamplight. For years it had been nothing more than paperwork. Now, it was proof that sometimes the smallest line of text could be a sword if wielded correctly. She traced the words with her fingertip, whispering them like a vow: termination without cause, full payout at market value. The words no longer felt like legal jargon. They were her story, her weapon, her victory carved into the very foundation of the company that had tried to erase her. She leaned back in her chair, the city's hum steady outside, and let the quiet wash over her. There was no audience, no applause, no dramatic curtain call. Only a woman and her hard-won dignity, sitting in the glow of a sunset that felt different because she had fought for it. For the first time in weeks, her shoulders eased, her breath steady. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't hiding. She was simply here, present, alive. And somewhere deep inside, a new certainty flickered to life. This was not the end of her story. It was only the beginning. It began with whispers. A week after Meline's wire transfer hit her account, she received a text from a former colleague she hadn't spoken to in months. "HR just called me out of the blue. Wanted to clarify my separation agreement. Did you have something to do with this?" 2 days later, another message: "They're offering me an additional payout." Not huge, but enough to admit they knew they were wrong. "Thank you, Meline." The dominoes had begun to fall. Meline hadn't posted anything online. She hadn't given interviews or bragged in hushed circles. But silence couldn't contain the truth forever. Stratocell's frantic attempts at damage control had exposed them more than any whistleblower could. The company had started calling former employees, revising agreements, offering settlements. And each call was a confession. Inside Stratocell, chaos simmered. Patricia held emergency meetings with HR teams, demanding files, cross-checks, calculations. The fluorescent-lit offices became war rooms, managers hunched over spreadsheets at midnight, trying to quantify the damage. "How many cases are we talking about?" one director asked during a late-night call. Patricia's voice was flat, exhausted. "At least a dozen in the last year alone." "If we extend further back," she trailed off. David Kessler slammed his pen against the table. "We're bleeding money. And every settlement sets a precedent. They'll keep coming until we have nothing left." The irony wasn't lost on him. Stratocell had treated equity like a savings account to raid, stripping loyal employees of what they'd earned. Now those same decisions were unraveling, costing the company tenfold what it had saved. Meline watched it unfold from a distance, piecing the story together through texts, emails, whispered calls from people too cautious to say much. Some messages were grateful. Others were angry. Why didn't I know sooner? Why didn't anyone tell us we had this right? She understood their anger. For years, the company had banked on silence. One by one, employees had walked away with severance packages that looked generous on the surface but hid theft in the fine print. Most had been too shocked, too tired, too beaten down to fight. Until now. Now, one fight had shown the rest that victory was possible. Meline sat at her desk, scrolling through the messages, her chest tight with a mixture of pride and unease. She hadn't planned to start a movement. She had only wanted justice for herself. But her victory had cracked the dam, and the water rushing through carried more than just her name. She remembered something Nora had said in the cafe: executives don't fear employees. They fear exposure. Now, exposure was everywhere. Nora called late one evening, her voice calm but edged with satisfaction. "They're scrambling. I've had 2 other former employees contact me this week, citing your case. Stratocell's legal team is working overtime." Meline hesitated. "Do you think I unleashed something bigger than I can control?" "Of course you did," Nora said dryly. "And that's the point. You showed them the system can be challenged. Whether you meant to or not, you gave others a blueprint. That's how change happens." Meline looked out her window at the glittering skyline, the same towers where executives still sat plotting. A part of her worried she had drawn too much attention, that she had painted a target on her back. But another part, stronger now, felt a quiet satisfaction. For once, Stratocell was the one afraid of its own employees. In the weeks that followed, the ripple widened. A small group of ex-employees began meeting in private, comparing notes. Stories surfaced: payouts missing, equity erased, silence enforced by NDAs. Each account was another crack in the facade Stratocell had built. Meline didn't attend the meetings, but her name came up in every conversation. She was the proof that the giant could be made to kneel. One afternoon, she received a handwritten note in the mail: "No return address. I got my equity back. Because of you." Management still jumps every time someone says the word equity. "Thank you." She read the note 3 times, then pinned it to her corkboard beside her framed contract. The 2 pieces of paper told the same story in different languages: a promise once broken, and a culture now haunted by the woman they tried to erase. At Stratocell, the unrest festered. Shareholders demanded answers. Analysts whispered about policy reviews and unexpected settlements. The aura of invincibility cracked. David Kessler stood at the window of his office late one night, staring at the city below. He had built his career on control, on the quiet elimination of problems before they grew teeth. Yet here he was, his empire shaken by a woman he barely remembered, someone who had once sat quietly in the back of strategy sessions. The humiliation stung almost as much as the financial loss. For Meline, the wave of change was both humbling and clarifying. She hadn't sought revenge beyond her own case, but she couldn't deny the satisfaction of seeing others find justice too. The silence had been broken, and silence, once broken, could never be restored. She sat by her window one evening, Finn purring softly beside her, and thought about how far she had come. From being expendable, invisible, dismissed with a signature, to being the catalyst for a reckoning inside the very walls that had once imprisoned her. The giant had stumbled. Others were rushing in to take their shots. And all she had done was refuse to disappear. It happened in the most ordinary of places. Meline was pushing a cart down the produce aisle of her neighborhood grocery store, absently comparing prices on apples, when a familiar voice called her name. She turned, and there he was, Martin. Her former manager. The man who had sat behind his desk and delivered the words that ended her 12-year career. Your role has been eliminated. For a moment, both froze. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and the distant beep of the checkout scanners filled the silence. Martin's expression flickered, first surprise, then something closer to guilt. Meline, he said awkwardly, adjusting the collar of his polo shirt. I didn't expect to see you here. Martin, she replied evenly. Her tone held no malice, but no warmth either. Just a name, spoken like a fact. He shifted, gripping the handle of his basket as though it might anchor him. How are you doing? Really well, actually. The answer came without hesitation, and it was true. For weeks she had practiced surviving. Now, she was living. Martin nodded, eyes darting to the floor. That's good. Really good. There was a pause, thick with unspoken words. He looked older, she realized. Not in years, but in weight, the kind of weariness that clung to a person who had been complicit in something they couldn't undo. How are things at Stratocell? She asked, letting the question hang like bait. Martin winced. Busy. Chaotic, honestly. Lots of changes. New policies. They've been reviewing everything. Reviewing everything. Meline almost smiled. She didn't need details to know what that meant. The wave she had set in motion was still rippling through the hall she once walked. Martin cleared his throat. I wanted you to know, I really didn't want it to happen the way it did. Your termination, I mean. I fought for you. But, he trailed off, his shoulders slumping. It was out of my hands. Meline studied him for a long moment. Once, his words might have mattered. Once, she might have needed the validation. But now, standing in the grocery aisle with her financial freedom secured and her dignity intact, his apology felt small. I know, she said simply. And she meant it. Martin wasn't the architect of her downfall. He had just been another cog in the machine, too bound to stop it. He exhaled, as though relieved she hadn't lashed out. Honestly, he admitted, lowering his voice, it's been a disaster since you left. We didn't realize how much you were doing until you weren't there anymore. They've had to hire 3 contractors just to cover the responsibilities you managed alone. For a fleeting moment, she almost felt pity. Almost. Well, she said, adjusting her grip on the cart, I'm sure they'll figure it out. She began to push forward, but Martin called after her. Meline. She stopped, turning slightly. For what it's worth, he said quietly, I'm glad things worked out for you. Their eyes met. His were tired, burdened. Hers were steady, unflinching. She offered a small smile. Thanks, Martin. Me too. Then she walked away, her cart wheels squeaking softly against the linoleum, leaving him standing alone among the apples and oranges. Driving home later, Meline replayed the encounter. Once, hearing Martin admit her value might have felt like victory. Now, it felt like closure. His words couldn't erase what had been done, but they confirmed what she already knew, Stratocell had underestimated her. And they were still paying for it. She thought of Nora's phrase, they wanted to erase you. We're going to make sure they can't. Martin's admission was proof of that. They hadn't erased her. They couldn't. Her absence haunted them, her name still carried weight in their corridors. Back in her apartment, she pinned a note to her corkboard beside her framed contract, they had to hire 3 people to replace me. It wasn't arrogance, it was evidence. Evidence of the invisible labor they had dismissed until it was gone. As the evening light streamed through her window, Meline sat with a sense of quiet power. The battle wasn't just about contracts or money. It was about presence. About proving that even when dismissed, undervalued, and written off, a single person could change the narrative. Stratacel's boardroom might still tremble with panic. Martin might still carry guilt in his eyes. But Meline had moved beyond both. She was no longer defined by what they took. She was defined by what she reclaimed. And as the city settled into night, she realized something profound. The true victory wasn't in the millions wired to her account. It was in the freedom to walk away from her past, head high, leaving those who betrayed her to reckon with the ruins of their choices. The underdog had won. And now, the giant was left to stumble in her shadow. 6 months later, the boardrooms of Stratacel still buzzed with paranoia, but Meline Pierce was nowhere near them. She sat in a new office, smaller, quieter, perched above a street lined with independent bookstores and cafes. A simple brass plaque by the door read, Pierce Advisory Group. No marble lobbies, no glass towers. Just a space filled with light, bookshelves, and a whiteboard already cluttered with ideas. Her first client, a mid-sized tech firm, sat across from her now, nervously recounting their problem. Their operations director had quit after discovering the company was undervaluing terminated employees' equity compensation. The fallout had rattled morale, threatened a merger, and spooked investors. "We don't want to become another Stratacel," the CEO admitted, his voice hushed, as though saying the name invoked a curse. Meline allowed herself the faintest smile. Another Stratacel. The phrase had already become shorthand in some circles for reckless greed and cultural collapse. And she was the reason why. She leaned forward, her tone calm but firm. "Then you start by acknowledging the damage. Transparency. Fairness. Pay what you owe, and rebuild trust. You can't buy loyalty with silence." That's the mistake they made. The CEO nodded quickly, scribbling notes. When the meeting ended, Meline shook his hand and watched him leave, the weight of her words lingering in the room. After he was gone, she walked to the window. The city sprawled beneath her, alive with possibility. For the first time in years, she wasn't tethered to someone else's corporate machinery. She was building her own. Her phone buzzed. A new email. Another potential client. Word was spreading fast. Companies who feared becoming the next Stratacel wanted her guidance. Irony, perhaps, that the very system that tried to erase her had created her niche. But she didn't call it irony. She called it justice. On her desk, the framed copy of her original employment contract sat beside the handwritten note from a former colleague. "Management still jumps every time someone says the word equity." Together, they formed a kind of shrine, not to bitterness, but to resilience. She touched the frame lightly, whispering, "You tried to erase me. Now I'm carved into your ledgers forever." Meanwhile, at Stratacel, the reckoning deepened. Shareholders grumbled. Analysts dissected quarterly reports, pointing out the spike in unexpected settlements. The phrase, internal culture review, appeared in press releases, though insiders knew it was code for panic. Meline heard the rumors through her network, directors resigning, HR overhauls, whispers of merger talks collapsing under scrutiny. She didn't gloat. She didn't need to. The company had become its own punishment. Her victory wasn't about watching Stratacel crumble. It was about ensuring they could never forget her. Every time they signed another settlement check, every time an employee asked about equity, her shadow lingered. She had become their permanent reminder that people were not disposable, and fine print could cut both ways. One evening, after a long day of meetings, she walked home through the city as twilight deepened. The air was cool, alive with the hum of traffic and laughter from nearby restaurants. She felt no bitterness, no lingering anger. Only clarity. The story could have ended differently. She could have signed their NDA, taken their hush money, and disappeared into anonymity. But instead, she had chosen the harder path, the path of resistance, the path of exposure. And that choice had rewritten not only her life but the lives of countless others. She paused at a crosswalk, the lights of skyscrapers glinting above. Somewhere in those towers, decisions were still being made in boardrooms much like the one she had once sat in. But she no longer belonged to them. She had written herself out of their story and into her own. When the light turned green, she stepped forward, her stride steady, her heart light. Back at her office, Finn hopped onto her desk, curling up beside the contract frame. She smiled, scratching behind his ears. Then she pulled out her notebook and began outlining ideas for her next client. There was work to do, and this time, the work was hers alone. The best revenge, she realized, wasn't about destruction. It wasn't about rage or even about winning a courtroom battle. The best revenge was this: living freely, thriving loudly, and building something that outlasted the people who tried to erase you. They had underestimated her. They had cast her aside. And yet here she was, stronger, sharper, unforgettable. The underdog had not only defeated the giant. She had built a life where giants no longer mattered. And that was the truest victory of all.